Question 8. I call on the Honourable Member for Ramsey, Mr Hooper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'd like to ask the Minister for the Environment, Food and Agriculture, further to his answer in the House of Keys on the 10th of November, when he expects the planning appeals awaiting a determination by the Minister to be resolved, what the standard turnaround time is for such appeals, and whether there are any delays in these cases being resolved.
On the Minister for Environment, Food and Agriculture to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In response to the Honourable Member's question on appeals, there are currently 13 appeals awaiting determination, of which 5 were received in the last 6 weeks. It is expected that 8 of these will be determined in the next 2 weeks. In terms of the standard turnaround time for appeals, there is a programme for government key performance indicator that 95% of appeals are turned around within 6 weeks of receiving the inspector's report. For the first 2 quarters of this year, 100% of decisions were issued in this timescale. For quarters 3 and quarters 4, 24% of appeals were issued within the 6-week time frame, 31% were issued out of the 6-week time frame, and 45% are awaiting determination, of which 38.5% were received within the last 6 weeks and 61.5% were received more than 6 weeks ago. There have been some delays in appeals being finally determined. This is partially due to administrative issues which have now been resolved, but it does need to be recognised that some cases are more complex and it takes longer to consider these, and in some instances it is appropriate for legal advice to be sought.
Question, Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The Minister in his answer there said 5 of the 13 that are currently on his desk were received in the last 6 weeks. That means 7 of the ones that he's received were not, or were received outside 6 weeks. Does he feel it appropriate that actually some of these planning applications, which could have significant impact on development in our towns and villages around the island, are actually sat awaiting his decision for, in some cases, 6, 7, 8, 9 weeks before anyone gets to hear back? And does he also think it's acceptable that actually none of these timescales are published or available anywhere, so when someone knows that the inspector's report has finished, has been handed over to the department, there is no real way of knowing how long it's going to take the Minister to decide on a particular application?
Minister to reply.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. First of all, I should say that in terms of my dealing with the appeal, or my delegated member, we normally turn these round within 48 hours. But there are some complex appeals that are not quite as simple as they appear, and if we are looking at a significant impact, that significant impact can be on the applicant or people who are against the application. So it's very important that we seek even additional planning advice and legal advice before we issue decisions. There have been administrative delays, and training, I believe, has now sorted some of those problems out, and I apologise where applications or appeals take long to determine than people anticipate, but there are good rationales behind that. We also have the additional problem that COVID has caused problems in the last 2 quarters. We are now in a situation again where UK inspectors, although they're key workers, will not come to the island to carry out site inspections, and we did have a slight hiatus earlier on when we were dealing with putting together the capacity to carry out virtual appeal hearings. That fortunately has now been solved, but we had this problem going forward that the inspectors won't come to the island at present. Maybe after December the 2nd that will resolve itself, but we are working on a methodology where we can take videos of sites and pass them on, but obviously the inspector has to be content that that is supplying sufficient information for them to make a valid decision.
Supplementary question, Mr Thomas.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Minister not agree that the 100% success rate for turnaround times might be slightly misleading, given the COVID arrangements and the special legal arrangements that were in place for appeals during that time period? Secondly, does the Minister agree, in this special situation with this backlog, might it not be helpful for the appeal inspectors' reports to be published early before the Minister's made up his mind?
Minister Trumbull.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I don't think the earlier quarters were misleading. We were doing well in turning appeals round, and COVID did pose significant challenges to the department. When it comes to publishing the decisions of the inspector prior to me or my delegated member making a decision, I think that would be inappropriate. The full report is published and when the decision is made, but I think it's appropriate the decision be made before the full report is made public.
Supplementary question, Mr Hooper.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. It's somewhat concerning to hear that despite the fact the Isle of Man's borders have been closed since March, the Department is still working on a virtual solution for planning inspectors. The COVID argument the Minister made is somewhat misleading, because the question I'm asking is in respect of inspectors' reports that have been completed and handed to his department, in some cases as far back as the 2nd of September, and we are still waiting on these decisions to be made, decisions to be turned around. I find it very difficult to accept that because you need additional planning advice or additional legal advice that this process takes, in these cases, more than 8 weeks. So I'd be grateful if the Minister could confirm that actually in respect of all those planning applications that are currently sat on his desk inside his department, that he will make sure they are all turned around as quickly as they can be.
Minister to reply.
Starting with the last question first, yes, it is my intention to move appeals through the department as quickly as possible. And going back to virtual site visits, it's not just as we can carry out those virtual site visits, but we want to be sure that both people on the appeal side, the applicants of the appeal, and the planning people who are subject to the appeal are satisfied that we are supplying sufficient information, and that the inspectors are content with the virtual site inspection. By far the best solution was, and has been until now, that planning inspectors are key workers and they come over and carry out their own site inspections. And it is our intention, providing matters resolve themselves on the 2nd of December, to continue with that process and the dialogue with the inspectors to see whether we can come up with a virtual solution that is satisfactory for all parties.
Supplementary question, Mr Thomas.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Given this troublesome situation with appeals and the ability to turn them round and the delay to that, has the Minister and the Department more generally recently, and government even, decided to make applications directly from government departments for planning, for instance with South Barul tourism accommodation, to avoid all of this troublesome appeals business?
Minister to reply.
I'm not sure that is part of the original question, but in terms of the process for department applications, there is a set process for that, which does include an inspector process, and we are not trying to circumvent anything to make expedient applications. We're just working with the system.
Please like and subscribe to the Isle of Man TV channel. Thank you.